You think you can just laugh at me and get away with it? The voice echoed silently through the courtroom before anyone could even respond. The morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Richmond District Courthouse, casting long lines of light and shadow across the polished oak benches. Officer David Miller leaned back in his chair, smirking as he whispered to the deputies nearby, his white uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent ceiling lights. He had seen Marcus Johnson enter the courtroom moments earlier and had already decided this was going to be a routine day of humiliation, just another defendant to belittle. Marcus walked with measured steps, his dark suit tailored precisely, a navy tie knotted with precision, and his polished black shoes tapping softly against the tiled floor. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the murmurs of the audience and rustle of legal documents creating a subtle undercurrent of tension. As Marcus passed the front row, his deep brown eyes scanned the room calmly, noting the reactions of everyone from the court reporters to the bailiffs. He exhaled slowly, each breath deliberate, projecting the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to authority and observation. The room held a certain chill despite the warmth outside, and the hum of the overhead lights seemed to underscore the invisible weight of expectation pressing down on him. Officer Miller, noticing the composed demeanor, chuckled under his breath and leaned forward. "Hope you're ready to answer some questions, son," he said, his voice carrying an edge of mockery meant to draw attention from the surrounding crowd. Marcus didn't flinch. He let the words pass like wind over stone, acknowledging them with nothing more than a subtle tightening of his jaw. He took a seat at the defendant's table, placing a neat leather briefcase before him, his fingers lightly resting on the handle as if it were an extension of his own calm. The murmurs grew louder, a few curious eyes darting toward him, sensing the subtle tension in the air. Officer Miller's smirk widened, believing he had already set the tone for the morning, assuming the power of the uniform alone would dominate the space. Marcus's posture was unwavering, his shoulders squared, his gaze unbroken, silently observing every gesture, every exchange of whispers between officers, every faint shuffle of papers, capturing details that would be significant. Later, the judge's gavel rested lightly in hand, tapping intermittently, a metronome to the rising tension, while the audience seemed to hold its collective breath. Marcus's mind wandered briefly to the files inside his briefcase, each document a record, a subtle but undeniable assertion of influence, though none would guess the weight those papers carried. Every footstep of the officers approaching the podium echoed faintly, a reminder of the perceived authority in the room. Yet Marcus remained a pillar of calm, allowing the overconfidence of Officer Miller to build unchecked. He adjusted his cufflinks, the movement small but precise, a quiet signal to himself that he was ready. The light from the windows caught on the edge of the briefcase, glinting slightly, drawing the eye just enough to hint at something beneath the surface. The audience's whispers formed a low murmur, blending with the shuffle of legal pads and the creak of benches under shifting weight. Marcus's expression never changed, though his mind catalogued each reaction, each subtle twitch of a finger, each glance exchanged, noting which moments might later unravel the carefully constructed arrogance in the room. The clock on the wall ticked audibly in the silence, marking minutes that seemed both slow and heavy with anticipation. Officer Miller continued to lean in, speaking in hushed tones to the deputy next to him, unaware that the very man he sought to belittle held the authority to shift the balance of power in the entire building. Marcus inhaled steadily, letting the tension rise, his inner calm a counterpoint to the outward display of confidence from the officers, each second drawing the inevitable closer. The room still unaware that this seemingly ordinary man was in fact the FBI director, poised to reveal a truth that would stun everyone present. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the bailiffs shuffled papers and adjusted their positions, their eyes flicking from Marcus Johnson to Officer David Miller with barely concealed curiosity. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, the leather briefcase resting neatly on the table before him, his hands folded lightly over it, fingers tapping an almost imperceptible rhythm that echoed a mind perpetually attentive. Outside the tall glass windows, sunlight reflected off the courthouse steps, casting lines of gold that seemed to highlight the quiet authority he projected. The crowd had begun to settle into their seats, a mixture of reporters with cameras and notepads, spectators holding their breath, sensing that something significant was poised to happen, though none could have anticipated the depth of control Marcus maintained over the moment. Officer Miller, meanwhile, whispered to his partner, a smirk lingering on his face, convinced that the subtle power of uniform and badge would intimidate any defendant. Yet Marcus remained serene, his gaze sweeping over the room with precision, noting each shifting posture, each small whisper exchanged among the spectators, cataloging them mentally as pieces in a puzzle only he could fully perceive. The judge, an older man with a gavel resting lightly in his hand, tapped the surface with slow, deliberate motion, a subtle signal that the proceedings were about to begin. Yet Marcus seemed to operate on a different rhythm, his calm presence a counterbalance to the tension that seemed to thicken the air, the quiet hum of the lighting fixtures above providing a backdrop to the silent anticipation. As the clerk began calling the roll, Marcus's eyes followed each name, each response, noting the subtle nods, the brief exchanges that suggested underlying dynamics within the court staff. While Officer Miller leaned forward slightly, catching fragments of conversation, his overconfidence a stark contrast to the poised vigilance Marcus embodied. The room felt simultaneously confined and expansive, the polished floors reflecting the tall windows, the walls adorned with historical portraits of justices and lawmen who had long shaped the legal landscape, creating an environment steeped in tradition, yet tense with the unspoken expectation of the present moment. Every step the officers took, every shuffle of paper, every subtle cough or clearing of a throat resonated differently around Marcus, as if the room itself had slowed to accommodate his presence, giving him the opportunity to observe, to measure, and to anticipate. He adjusted the collar of his suit subtly, a minor motion imbued with careful deliberation, signaling a readiness to act not through force, but through the calculated influence of his position and understanding. The spectators shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others reclining slightly, all caught in the silent current of anticipation that flowed from Marcus's quiet composure, their attention tethered to his movements, to the precision of his calm gestures. Officer Miller, oblivious to the mental strategies Marcus employed, continued to whisper and smirk, believing control rested entirely with him, failing to sense the meticulous awareness that Marcus wielded. With subtle, commanding presence, a reporter shifted, adjusting a microphone, while another scribbled notes rapidly, eyes darting between Marcus and the proceedings, capturing the tension that filled the room. Marcus's pulse remained steady, his mind orchestrating an awareness of every element in the space. The glint of the gavel, the faint reflections on the polished floors, the collective breathing of the audience as it synchronized in anticipation. Outside, a faint breeze rustled the leaves of trees lining the courthouse square, a soft contrast to the charged atmosphere inside, underscoring the quiet intensity that Marcus maintained, a stillness that spoke louder than any words could. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the beginning of testimony, and the room fell into a hushed expectancy, each individual momentarily suspended, as if the building itself held its breath. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with focused attention, each subtle movement an indication of awareness, of control, and of readiness, while Officer Miller straightened in his chair, unaware that the true measure of authority was not in his uniform or his words, but in the calm, measured presence of the man he assumed he could belittle. Every detail in the room, the shuffle of papers, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the almost imperceptible shifting of weight among the spectators, was registered by Marcus, cataloged as part of a comprehensive understanding of the environment, a silent preparation for the moment when perception would be transformed into revelation. Time seemed both elongated and suspended as the first statement was about to be heard, the air thick with anticipation, the tension in the room building in an almost tangible wave, while Marcus maintained an unbroken calm, the measured steadiness of his posture and gaze conveying a quiet authority that even the most confident observer could not ignore. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle movement of the officers and audience became part of a pattern he discerned with clarity, a lattice of observation that prepared the stage for what was quietly inevitable. The realization that control and influence are often wielded not through overt power, but through the precise, calculated presence of someone who understands both the people and the space they occupy. The proceedings began, the first words spoken with formal cadence, and Marcus listened. The rhythm of speech, the inflection of voices, and the nuances of the courtroom captured with deliberate attention, a mental map forming of the entire interaction, each element to be accounted for and engaged with at the precise moment it would carry the greatest impact. Marcus adjusted his posture slightly, the leather of his briefcase creaking softly under the subtle movement, his eyes still scanning every face in the courtroom with quiet intensity. Officer David Miller shifted in his seat, unaware that his every gesture, every whispered comment, and every small smirk was catalogued and interpreted by a man whose mind moved with meticulous precision. The air felt heavier now, charged with an anticipation that seemed to pulse beneath the polished wood of the benches and the high ceilings of the courtroom. Marcus's gaze lingered on the officers at the rear, noting the patterns of their interactions, the brief exchanges of eye contact, and the subtle adjustments of papers and folders that indicated assumptions of power and control. Each sound was amplified in the stillness. The soft tapping of a pen, the faint scrape of a chair leg against tile, the almost imperceptible shift of a courtroom observer adjusting in their seat. The audience collectively held its breath as the proceedings continued, the rhythm of the judge's voice serving as a metronome for the tension that built quietly, insidiously, around Marcus's calm presence. He took a slow, measured breath, his shoulders squared, his hands resting lightly atop the briefcase, fingers interlacing with precision, signaling both patience and readiness. Outside the tall windows, the sunlight angled sharply, illuminating small motes of dust drifting in the golden light, casting fleeting patterns across the polished floors that reflected both the literal and metaphorical clarity of the situation. Marcus's mind tracked each subtle movement, each hushed conversation, each reaction of the spectators, compiling a comprehensive map of the room, an internal blueprint of influence and observation. Officer Miller, meanwhile, leaned forward, still confident in the assumption that visible authority dictated the flow of the courtroom, oblivious to the subtle currents Marcus was reading and controlling. Marcus's expression remained calm, his lips pressed lightly together, eyes steady, observing the audience's reactions, the quickening breaths of a few spectators, the barely noticeable frown of a reporter scribbling notes, the tilt of a head as someone tried to discreetly glance at the documents Marcus had placed before him. The room felt simultaneously constrained by tradition and expansive in expectation, the tall ceilings and wide windows giving a sense of history and weight to the proceedings, while the current tension seemed to compress every detail into a singular focus of observation. Marcus allowed a barely perceptible nod, a recognition of a subtle shift in Officer Miller's demeanor, an acknowledgement that the moment was approaching, that the dynamic balance in the room was on the cusp of transformation. The gavel tapped lightly against the block, a soft punctuation that did not break Marcus's composure, but rather served as a cue for the unfolding rhythm he had anticipated, the procedural formalities and spoken statements all aligning into a sequence he had mentally rehearsed. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to underscore the quiet intensity, the invisible charge in the air that Marcus harnessed through sheer focus and presence, every sound and movement mapped into a narrative that he controlled silently. The first witnesses approached the stand, their steps measured, eyes cautious, aware of the tension in the air, yet unaware of the silent orchestration Marcus maintained. He adjusted his tie with a slow precision, a minor gesture, yet one that projected control, a deliberate signal to himself and to the room that he was fully aware, fully engaged, and ready to act not through overt declaration, but through the poised authority that came from knowing the environment and the people within it intimately. Every click of a pen, every shuffle of papers, every breath drawn by spectators became part of the intricate web Marcus observed and navigated, his mind noting the weight of expectations, the subtle biases, and the assumptions of power that hung in the air like invisible threads. Time seemed both to stretch and to hold, moments elongated as the atmosphere thickened, the tension building in quiet anticipation of the critical reveal that would shift perception and recalibrate authority within the walls of the courthouse. Marcus remained steady, poised, each movement minimal yet meaningful, projecting an unshakable calm that contrasted sharply with the underestimation by Officer Miller and others, a silent assertion that control and influence were often wielded not through visible dominance, but through measured presence, observation, and the quiet application of knowledge and strategy. The audience leaned slightly forward, collectively sensing a subtle shift, the rhythm of the courtroom now intertwined with the latent expectation that something consequential was imminent, all while Marcus maintained a calmness that suggested both patience and the imminent precision of his next deliberate action. The room remained still, the low murmur of spectators a quiet backdrop to the precise focus Marcus maintained. Each person in the courtroom seemed to exist in a bubble of anticipation, their attention tethered to subtle movements and expressions, while Marcus's dark brown eyes scanned the gallery with calculated calm. Officer David Miller continued his quiet chatter with nearby deputies, confident in his assumed dominance, unaware that Marcus had cataloged every whisper, every shift in posture, and every glance exchanged. The polished wooden floors reflected the sunlight streaming through the windows, creating thin lines of light that cut across the benches and highlighted the meticulous arrangement of files and papers on Marcus's table. The judge adjusted his robe slightly, the gavel tapping softly in rhythm with his measured breathing, while the room seemed suspended in a delicate balance between procedural formality and the rising tension that Marcus quietly controlled. Marcus leaned back slightly, his hands resting lightly atop the leather briefcase, the faint scent of polished wood and paper filling the air around him, grounding him as he observed the subtle dynamics at play. The audience shifted in their seats, leaning forward or reclined slightly, their collective awareness heightened by the silent gravity that Marcus projected, each breath and shuffle of paper resonating as a note in the complex symphony of the courtroom. Officer Miller, emboldened by his uniform and confident in the assumed sway of authority, remained unaware of the layers of perception Marcus had mapped, the careful awareness that allowed him to anticipate responses and adjust subtly to maintain the upper hand without overt action. The hum of the fluorescent lights above added a subtle cadence, punctuating the quiet anticipation, while Marcus's mind traced every angle, every line of sight, every subtle indication of expectation or judgment from the spectators. Outside, a light breeze shifted the branches of trees lining the courthouse steps, a gentle contrast to the charged energy within, as Marcus's posture remained measured, his breathing steady, each inhalation a silent reinforcement of composure. The first witness began their testimony, their measured words a counterpoint to the silent observation Marcus maintained, cataloging nuances in voice inflection, timing, and eye movement that revealed underlying assumptions or confidence in the room. Every minute adjustment, the tilt of a head, the subtle movement of fingers on a pen, the shifting of weight in a chair, was registered with deliberate precision, each a piece in the invisible puzzle Marcus was assembling. Officer Miller's focus remained on the superficial display of control, missing the intricate web of awareness Marcus maintained, the quiet accumulation of influence that would ultimately manifest in the forthcoming revelation. Marcus allowed a small, deliberate shift in posture, a subtle cue to himself that the timing was approaching, that the alignment of attention and expectation in the room had reached the threshold necessary for transformation. The light through the tall windows created fleeting patterns across the polished floors, reflecting in Marcus's eyes, a visual accompaniment to the methodical clarity of his presence. The spectators collectively sensed the weight of the moment, their movements slowed, their breaths almost synchronized in anticipation, as Marcus's quiet authority began to dominate the space without a single overt gesture. The subtle rhythm of the gavel, the soft shuffle of papers, the faint clicks of pens, all were absorbed and noted, forming a silent map of the environment and its actors. Marcus's mind integrated these signals seamlessly, calculating the precise moment when the perception of control in the room would shift, when assumptions would be challenged, and the latent awareness of his authority fully registered. The room remained poised on the edge of revelation, each person caught in the balance between expectation and surprise, while Marcus's calm, measured presence radiated a quiet command that subtly reoriented the energy of the courtroom, preparing for the moment when observation would become influence, and anticipation would give way to the undeniable assertion of his position. Every subtle detail, the ambient temperature, the faint reflection of light, the almost imperceptible cadence of footsteps, was incorporated into the mental framework Marcus had built, each element reinforcing the quiet yet undeniable authority he held over the unfolding scene. A control exercised not through overt dominance, but through the measured, deliberate observation and engagement with every aspect of the environment and the people within it. Marcus allowed his eyes to sweep across the room again, catching the subtle changes in posture and expression that had begun to ripple through the audience. The spectators, once quietly observing, now leaned forward slightly, their attention sharpened, sensing the invisible shift in authority that Marcus radiated with controlled precision. Officer David Miller continued to whisper to a nearby deputy, his confident smirk unwavering, yet there was a slight hesitation in the tilt of his head, a micro-expression unnoticed by most, but registered immediately by Marcus. The polished wood of the benches reflected the morning light streaming through the tall windows, casting long, golden streaks across the courtroom floor that seemed to illuminate Marcus's composed figure. He reached slowly for the top of his briefcase, fingers brushing over the leather with the lightest pressure, a silent assertion of presence, of readiness, and of measured control. Every shuffle of paper, every scrape of a chair, and every faint cough from the audience was absorbed into Marcus's awareness, cataloged and interpreted, forming a mental map of both environment and intent. The judge adjusted slightly in his chair, the gavel tapping softly, a rhythm that seemed to coincide almost instinctively with the pacing of Marcus's observation. Outside, the sun glinted off the steps of the courthouse, casting fleeting patterns through the windows that danced across the spectators' faces, adding an almost cinematic quality to the tense yet controlled atmosphere. Marcus exhaled slowly, each breath deliberate, maintaining a calm that contrasted sharply with the subtle unease now appearing in Officer Miller's movements. The audience shifted in minor but noticeable ways, leaning forward, tilting their heads, murmuring quietly, their attention increasingly anchored to the quiet dominance Marcus displayed. He allowed a subtle tightening of his fingers on the briefcase handle, a signal to himself that the timing was approaching, that the sequence of observation and perception was aligning perfectly for the inevitable transformation of awareness in the room. Every detail, the faint hum of the lights, the subtle reflections on the polished floors, the measured rhythm of the judge's gestures, was integrated into his awareness, each element reinforcing the silent assertion of authority Marcus maintained without overt declaration. Officer Miller, still confident in the power of his uniform, failed to perceive the meticulous orchestration of attention and perception that Marcus conducted with quiet mastery. Marcus's gaze lingered momentarily on the spectators, registering the slight quickening of breaths, the fleeting glances exchanged between reporters and officers, and the almost imperceptible lean forward of those seated in the gallery, all indicating the rising anticipation and the silent acknowledgement of the presence that Marcus projected. He adjusted his suit subtly, the motion small but deliberate, an understated gesture that mirrored the precision and control he wielded in the room. The court clerk shuffled papers, the faint rustle adding to the rhythm of tension, each sound a cue for Marcus to measure, to integrate, and to maintain the calm assertion of awareness that would guide the unfolding perception of authority. The room seemed to breathe in tandem with him, each subtle movement, each whisper, and each quiet shuffle contributing to a collective attention that he managed through presence rather than force. Marcus's posture remained straight, his shoulders squared, his hands lightly resting on the briefcase, a visual anchor for the controlled energy he projected. Time itself seemed to stretch, elongated by the focused observation and the quiet anticipation that he cultivated, the subtle tension building incrementally with each passing moment. The first official statements were beginning, their cadence measured, their formality contrasting with the underlying current of attention and expectation Marcus maintained, a deliberate interplay between procedural ritual and the silent command of presence. Every breath, every glance, every sound became part of the intricate lattice Marcus had created within the room, a framework of influence that would shift perception and subtly recalibrate authority when the moment arrived. The room remained poised on the edge of awareness, the collective focus of all present drawn subtly but firmly to the controlled and deliberate poise of Marcus, whose calm and measured presence quietly dominated the atmosphere, signaling that the unfolding sequence was approaching the critical alignment necessary for perception, influence, and the assertion of his carefully maintained authority. Marcus felt a subtle shift in the air, a ripple of awareness passing through the courtroom as the procedural statements continued. The murmurs had quieted slightly, each spectator now fully attuned to the quiet authority he radiated without a single overt gesture. Officer David Miller adjusted in his chair, a hint of unease flickering across his face, though he quickly masked it with a forced smirk, unaware that Marcus had noted every micro-expression and interpreted it as a measure of the underlying tension. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows painted patterns across the polished wooden floors, tracing the edges of Marcus's leather briefcase and the folds of his suit with sharp, clear lines. Each movement in the room, footsteps of the clerk, the gentle rustle of papers, the subtle sighs from the audience, was integrated into Marcus's awareness, cataloged with precision, forming a complete mental map of the environment. He allowed a brief pause before shifting his hands slightly, the smallest gesture imbued with control, signaling patience and readiness as the courtroom rhythm continued. The judge tapped the gavel lightly, a measured punctuation to the proceedings, while Marcus's gaze remained steady, sweeping over the spectators, officers, and court personnel, noting every flicker of attention, every hint of expectation or doubt. Outside, the trees lining the courthouse steps swayed gently in a soft breeze, a quiet contrast to the charged, focused energy inside, mirroring the calm determination Marcus maintained despite the subtle tension. The audience, sensing a quiet dominance that seemed to permeate the space, leaned in slightly, their collective attention drawn to his composed figure, while Officer Miller continued to underestimate the quiet power of observation that Marcus wielded. Every small sound, the click of a pen, the faint shuffle of feet, the quiet clearing of a throat, was recorded in Marcus's mind, not as distraction but as data, pieces of a larger pattern he was both observing and subtly influencing. He straightened slightly, shoulders squared, eyes unwavering, projecting a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the growing uncertainty of the officer who had assumed command of the room. The judge shifted, adjusting papers, while the rhythm of the gavel continued, marking moments that Marcus integrated seamlessly into his awareness, each tap a cue that further sharpened the tension and anticipation. Spectators' movements, previously subtle, became more noticeable, heads tilted, breaths measured, all responding to the undercurrent of control Marcus exerted without overt demonstration. The sunlight shifted slightly, casting fleeting reflections across the polished floor, highlighting the precision of Marcus's posture, the light glinting off the edge of the briefcase, as if signaling readiness. Marcus exhaled slowly, deliberately, each breath reinforcing composure and focus, projecting a steady energy that subtly drew the room's attention and shifted the perception of authority without a single word. Officer Miller leaned slightly forward, whispering once again, yet his smirk faltered momentarily as he registered, perhaps unconsciously, the presence of a calm, measured force that contrasted with the superficial confidence of uniformed authority. Marcus's mind processed every detail, the subtle exchange of glances among the spectators, the slight adjustments of papers by the court clerks, the rhythm of steps across the polished floor, all integrated into a comprehensive understanding of the environment and its dynamics. The room seemed to synchronize with his awareness, each whisper, shuffle, and movement contributing to the invisible architecture of control Marcus maintained. Every subtle detail, the ambient temperature, the flickering light, the cadence of the judge's voice, was observed, cataloged, and woven into a silent network of influence, preparing for the precise moment when perception would shift and the latent authority he held would become unmistakable to all present. Time stretched as the proceedings unfolded, each second measured, each movement significant, building toward the inevitable alignment of attention and realization that would redefine the sense of power and control in the courtroom, while Marcus maintained an unbroken calm, the center of a quiet storm of observation, awareness, and poised readiness, a stillness that commanded attention and subtly guided the room toward the forthcoming revelation. Marcus lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting those of Officer David Miller with a steady, unflinching gaze that seemed to carry the weight of quiet authority. The air in the courtroom shifted subtly, a perceptible pause spreading among the spectators, as if the room itself sensed the impending change in energy. Marcus's presence, calm yet resolute, drew attention without a single word, each breath measured, each movement deliberate, the polished floors reflecting the sunlight that highlighted the precise lines of his tailored suit and the polished edges of his briefcase. Officer Miller leaned slightly forward, expecting to maintain control, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, almost imperceptible, as Marcus's silent command of the space became undeniable. The judge's gavel rested lightly in hand, paused as if acknowledging the growing tension, while Marcus's mind cataloged every reaction, every subtle adjustment in posture, every intake of breath from the audience, weaving them into a coherent understanding of the unfolding moment. The sunlight streamed across the courtroom in sharp angles, illuminating the rows of spectators, each face caught between curiosity and quiet anticipation, their focus anchored by the composed energy Marcus exuded. Marcus reached for the leather briefcase again, fingers resting lightly on the handle, a minimal movement that conveyed readiness and attention without force, signaling a poised control that subtly radiated across the room. Every shuffle of paper, every whispered exchange, every faint shift of weight among the spectators was noted, analyzed, and integrated into Marcus's awareness, forming a lattice of perception that allowed him to remain steps ahead in the silent dynamics of the courtroom. Officer Miller's smirk faltered briefly, replaced by a tightening around the eyes and a slight adjustment in posture, a subconscious response to the quiet authority now emanating from Marcus, though he remained unaware of the depth and precision of the observation he was under. The murmurs of the audience grew quieter, their attention sharpening, drawn not by overt declaration, but by the subtle influence of presence, the calm and measured poise that Marcus maintained like a silent anchor. Marcus exhaled slowly, deliberately, his posture straight, shoulders squared, projecting a composed energy that commanded attention, guiding perception without a single audible cue. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above added a subtle rhythm to the tension, each small flicker reinforcing the sense of anticipation that had built steadily since his arrival. Outside the windows, the soft breeze shifted the leaves of the courthouse trees, a quiet, almost poetic contrast to the charged atmosphere inside, highlighting the composed stillness Marcus maintained amidst the silent expectancy. Marcus's gaze swept across the spectators once more, taking in every tilt of the head, every micro-expression, every subtle body shift, cataloging them with meticulous attention, preparing for the precise alignment of timing and awareness necessary for the moment of revelation. The judge shifted papers, tapping the gavel lightly, while Marcus's presence anchored the room, projecting a quiet authority that reshaped the collective attention, drawing the focus naturally and subtly to him. Every sound, every reflection of light, every faint rustle became a part of the mental framework Marcus maintained, an intricate lattice of observation and influence that readied the room for the impending realignment of perception. Time seemed to stretch, moments elongating as the silent orchestration unfolded, each second heightening the expectation, the tension, and the sense of imminent transformation. Marcus remained still, yet every detail of his subtle movements and composed energy contributed to a growing awareness among the audience and officers alike, establishing the unspoken understanding that the balance of authority in the room was quietly, irrevocably shifting. The courtroom felt alive with anticipation, each individual caught between procedural routine and the unseen assertion of presence that Marcus wielded, the culmination of observation, poise, and silent command drawing everyone toward the pivotal moment when perception and authority would be unmistakably aligned. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath, his hands resting lightly atop the leather briefcase, the faint creak of its surface audible only in the stillness of the room. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows cast shifting patterns across the polished wooden floors, catching the edges of his suit and highlighting the precision of his composed posture. Officer David Miller shifted slightly in his chair, an almost imperceptible hesitation in his movements betraying a flicker of awareness that Marcus had already registered. The audience leaned forward subtly, their attention drawn to the calm authority emanating from Marcus, each individual seemingly suspended in anticipation of what was silently unfolding. Marcus allowed his gaze to sweep across the courtroom once more, noting the slight tightening of brows, the brief exchange of glances among spectators, and the small adjustments in the posture of the officers, cataloging every subtle cue as part of a larger understanding of the dynamics at play. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, punctuating the measured cadence of the proceedings, yet Marcus remained perfectly poised, his calm energy contrasting sharply with the minor tension now detectable in Officer Miller's demeanor. Outside, the breeze shifted the leaves of the courthouse trees, their soft rustle a quiet counterpoint to the charged atmosphere inside, reflecting the stillness and control Marcus maintained despite the undercurrent of expectation in the room. Marcus's breathing remained slow and steady, each exhalation reinforcing the composed presence he projected, subtly anchoring the collective attention of the courtroom to him. The faint hum of fluorescent lights above added a gentle rhythm to the tension, each flicker of illumination highlighting the attentive expressions of the spectators and reinforcing the sense of quiet anticipation. Marcus's eyes lingered on the audience, observing the nuanced shifts in engagement, a slight lean forward, a rapid blink, the subtle narrowing of eyes, all indicators of the heightened awareness now permeating the room. The polished floors reflected both the sunlight and the concentrated energy of the space, creating a visual echo of Marcus's precise, measured presence. Every small movement, the shuffle of papers, the adjustment of a chair, the whispered word of a court officer, was absorbed into his awareness, analyzed, and integrated into a silent orchestration of control and influence. Officer Miller remained confident in his assumed authority, but the subtle cues he emitted betrayed a growing recognition, however subconscious, of the command Marcus held over the room. The murmurs of the spectators quieted almost imperceptibly, the energy of the courtroom now largely tethered to the poised figure at the defendant's table, each person drawn to the calm determination Marcus exuded. The judge shifted slightly, scanning the room with a practiced gaze, the gavel tapping softly as Marcus's presence quietly guided the rhythm and attention of the proceedings. Marcus allowed a minimal adjustment of his posture, a deliberate, small movement that reinforced his quiet dominance, signaling patience and readiness without a single word or gesture that could be construed as overt assertion. The audience collectively sensed the gravity of the moment, the tension building in measured increments, each second stretching as Marcus's composed energy subtly realigned the perception of authority within the room. The sunlight shifted again, highlighting different angles of the courtroom and casting fleeting reflections across the faces of the spectators, each micro-adjustment reinforcing the poised intensity Marcus maintained. Every sound, every movement, every subtle gesture now contributed to the architecture of perception he controlled, a silent web of influence that prepared the room for the pivotal moment of awareness. The clock ticked softly on the wall, marking the slow progression of time, each second elongating the anticipation, while Marcus remained perfectly still, a center of calm amidst the quiet, charged environment, his presence silently asserting the alignment of attention and authority that had been building since he entered the courtroom. The room felt taut with expectation, the collective focus drawn entirely to the measured, deliberate poise of Marcus, whose quiet command had begun to reshape the energy, awareness, and perception of power in the space, preparing all present for the inevitable revelation that would crystallize the true dynamic of authority and influence. Marcus finally allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch his lips, the room shifting imperceptibly as if acknowledging the subtle assertion of his presence. Every eye in the courtroom followed his movements, the anticipation and curiosity palpable, the energy that had been building since his entrance reaching its natural apex. Officer David Miller's confident posture wavered, the faintest tightening around his eyes revealing the realization that the dynamic in the room had changed irrevocably. Marcus lifted his briefcase slightly, resting his hand on the handle, the minimal movement commanding attention without the need for words, his calm authority radiating throughout the space. Sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the glint of the polished leather, drawing the eyes of spectators and officers alike, each subtle reflection emphasizing the quiet strength and deliberate presence Marcus maintained. The judge shifted slightly, adjusting papers and glancing across the courtroom. Yet Marcus's steady gaze seemed to anchor the attention of all, subtly drawing the collective focus and reinforcing his quiet dominance over the environment. The audience leaned in, collectively absorbing the poised, deliberate energy, their reactions shifting almost imperceptibly as the undercurrent of authority emanating from Marcus-guided perception without any overt signal. Officer Miller's smirk faded completely, replaced by an expression that suggested careful reassessment, though Marcus did not address him directly, his presence alone recalibrating the understanding of power and attention in the room. Every whisper, every rustle of paper, every adjustment in posture among the spectators and officers contributed to the intricate mental map Marcus had built, a lattice of observation and influence that allowed him to remain steps ahead in both perception and subtle control. He exhaled slowly, each breath a measured reinforcement of calm, projecting a quiet energy that captured the room's focus and subtly realigned the perceived balance of authority. The polished wooden floors reflected the sunlight and the subtle movements of Marcus, creating a visual echo that amplified the effect of his composed posture and steady demeanor. Outside, the courthouse trees shifted in a soft breeze, a quiet contrast to the controlled intensity within, highlighting the deliberate patience Marcus maintained as he prepared for the culminating moment. The murmurs among spectators softened further, their attention sharpening, fully engaged with the poised figure at the defendant's table, each individual now attuned to the subtle rhythm and presence Marcus wielded. The gavel tapped lightly once more, the judge's cadence merging with the silent orchestration Marcus maintained, each strike punctuating the quiet anticipation that hung thick in the air. Marcus allowed a slight, deliberate adjustment of his posture, a minor movement that reinforced his measured readiness and subtly guided the attention of everyone present, signaling that the moment of revelation was imminent. Every sound, every flicker of light, every subtle motion contributed to the architecture of perception he controlled, creating a charged yet silent anticipation that prepared the room for the decisive alignment of awareness. Time stretched, elongated by the collective focus and the quiet assertion of authority Marcus projected, the tension now a tangible presence that seemed to hover in the polished air of the courtroom. The audience's breaths, once varied, now synchronized subtly with the energy Marcus exuded, each shift in attention reinforcing the anticipation. Officer Miller remained seated, rigid and unsteady beneath the calm weight of observation, the room collectively poised at the brink of the critical moment. Marcus's gaze swept across the courtroom one final time, integrating every detail, every micro-expression, every subtle reaction into the framework of influence he had meticulously cultivated. And then, with the quietest of movements, a subtle lift of the briefcase and the calm certainty in his posture, the room recognized, without a single word spoken, the full measure of authority and influence Marcus commanded, the culmination of patience, observation, and silent control crystallizing in a moment of undeniable presence that redefined perception and commanded the attention and respect of all within the space.